June 1942, somewhere over the industrial heartland of the Third Reich, where the night sky was thick with smoke and searchlight beams and tracer fire, a British Lancaster bomber crew suddenly heard through their headphones a sound that should have meant salvation, but instead would eventually betray them to the enemy. A high-pitched electronic beeping emanating from a newly installed device mounted beneath their tail turret, a tail-warning radar system officially designated ARI 5664 but known to air crews simply as Monica, named after a woman in a popular song of the era, and designed to provide bomber crews with precious seconds of warning when German night fighters approached from behind, the most vulnerable angle of attack where darkness and blind spots made visual detection almost impossible, and where hundreds of RAF bombers had already been blown apart by cannon fire before their gunners ever knew danger approached. Monica represented one of the most sophisticated pieces of electronic warfare technology available in 1942, operating at frequencies around 300 MHz on the boundary between VHF and UHF bands, sending pulses of radio energy backwards from the aircraft in a cone-shaped pattern that extended roughly 1,000 yards behind and below the bomber. And when those pulses encountered another aircraft and bounced back to Monica's receiver, the system would alert the crew through both visual indicators on a small cathode ray tube display and through audible beeping tones that intensified as the contact drew closer, theoretically giving rear gunners enough warning to rotate their turrets toward the threat and unleash defensive fire before the German night fighter pilot could position his aircraft for the kill. The development of Monica had taken place at the Bomber Support Development Unit in Worcestershire, under conditions of extraordinary secrecy, part of a broader British effort to apply rapidly advancing radar technology to the specific problems of strategic bombing over occupied Europe and Germany itself, where RAF Bomber Command under Air Marshal Arthur Harris had committed itself to a campaign of area bombing designed to destroy German industrial capacity and break civilian morale through sustained attacks on cities and production centers, attacks that required hundreds of heavy bombers to penetrate deep into enemy territory through defensive systems that grew more sophisticated and deadly with each passing month as the Luftwaffe's night fighter force expanded, and German radar technology improved to match and sometimes exceed British capabilities. The men who flew these bombing missions understood that their survival depended on a combination of factors, including aircraft performance, crew coordination, defensive armament, electronic countermeasures, tactical formations, and increasingly on the radar and radio equipment that allowed them to navigate through darkness and detect threats before those threats detected them. And Monica seemed to represent a genuine technological advantage in the deadly chess game between RAF bombers and Luftwaffe night fighters, a game where each side constantly sought to develop new capabilities that would shift the balance of survival in their favor, and where the consequences of falling behind technologically meant death for the men who flew with obsolete equipment into skies patrolled by enemies equipped with superior systems. Initially, Monica appeared to work exactly as designed, providing bomber crews with warnings that allowed them to take evasive action or prepare defensive fire. And as more RAF heavy bombers were fitted with the system throughout 1942 and into 1943, crews developed increasing confidence in this electronic guardian that watched their vulnerable tail section and promised to alert them before German night fighters could close to firing range. But what those crews did not know and could not have suspected was that their protective radar was simultaneously broadcasting their exact position to the enemy, that every pulse Monica sent out looking for threats was also serving as a beacon that German scientists had learned to detect and exploit, and that the very technology meant to save their lives was instead marking them for death in ways that would only become apparent after hundreds of bombers and thousands of airmen had already been lost to an enemy capability that remained completely unknown to British intelligence until a remarkable stroke of luck in July 1944 would finally reveal how thoroughly the defensive advantage had been reversed. The German response to Monica began almost immediately after the Luftwaffe captured intact examples of the British radar system from crashed bombers that fell on German-controlled territory, with the first Monica-equipped aircraft falling into German hands in February 1943, just 7 days after the system became operational, an almost unbelievably rapid intelligence failure that gave German scientists immediate access to the frequencies, pulse patterns, and operational characteristics of Britain's newest defensive technology. At research facilities operated by Siemens and Halske, German engineers quickly recognized that while Monica operated as an active radar transmitting pulses and listening for echoes, those transmissions could be detected by a passive receiver tuned to the appropriate frequencies. And because Monica was constantly broadcasting its presence whenever it was turned on, their passive detector wouldn't need to transmit any signals of its own, and therefore couldn't be detected by Allied electronic listening equipment, creating an asymmetric advantage where German night fighters could track RAF bombers without revealing their own positions until the moment they opened fire. The device that emerged from this research effort was designated Funkgerät 227 Flensburg, named after the German city near the Danish border, and it represented a devastatingly effective exploitation of Allied technology, using wing-mounted and tail-mounted dipole antennas tuned to detect the mid-VHF band frequencies between 170 and 220 MHz, which corresponded to the subharmonic frequencies generated by Monica's 300 MHz transmissions, allowing Flensburg to home in on RAF bombers from extraordinary distances that far exceeded Monica's own detection range. German night fighter crews equipped with Flensburg could detect Monica-equipped bombers from up to 100 kilometers away, could track individual aircraft within large bomber streams, consisting of hundreds of planes, and could use the bearing information provided by Flensburg to guide themselves directly toward their targets without ever appearing on the bomber crew's Monica display, until they had closed to within Monica's much shorter detection range of roughly 1,000 yards, by which time it was often too late for the bomber to take effective evasive action, because the German pilot had already positioned himself perfectly for an attack run from below and behind, the classic killing position that accounted for the majority of successful night fighter intercepts. The introduction of Flensburg into Luftwaffe service, beginning in early 1944, marked a catastrophic turning point in the air war over Europe. Though neither British intelligence nor RAF Bomber Command initially understood what was happening, knew only that bomber losses were increasing to unsustainable levels during the first half of 1944, with particularly devastating casualties during the series of massive raids against Berlin that Air Marshal Harris had launched, believing that destruction of the German capital would break Nazi resistance and perhaps end the war without requiring the massive ground invasion being planned for France. The Battle of Berlin, as this campaign became known, ran from November 1943 through March 1944, and ultimately cost Bomber Command more than 1,000 aircraft and approximately 7,000 aircrew killed or captured, losses that were significantly higher than Harris had anticipated, and that demonstrated conclusively that German night fighter defenses had achieved some new level of effectiveness that British countermeasures were failing to neutralize. But the specific reason for this increased lethality remained a mystery that British intelligence struggled to explain through the first half of 1944, while bomber crews continued flying with Monica active, unknowingly broadcasting their positions to every Flensburg-equipped night fighter within 100 kilometers of their flight path. The truth about Flensburg and Monica's catastrophic vulnerability emerged on the morning of July 13th, 1944, when a Junkers Ju-88 G1 night fighter from 7 Staffel of Nachtjagdgeschwader 2, the 2nd Night Fighter Wing of the Luftwaffe, accidentally landed at Royal Air Force Woodbridge in Suffolk, England, a navigation error so profound and consequential that it would immediately change how RAF Bomber Command prosecuted its campaign against Germany and would save the lives of countless Allied airmen who would otherwise have died. With Monica betraying their positions to enemy fighters, the Ju-88 that landed at Woodbridge carried a full suite of the latest German night fighting equipment, including not only the Flensburg detector, but also the Liechtenstein SN2 airborne intercept radar, the Fuji 350 Naxos Z passive receiver for homing on RAF H-2S bombing radar emissions, and various other systems that collectively represented the most advanced German night fighting capability available in mid-1944. And when British technical intelligence officers examined this intelligence, they quickly realized that the Flensburg equipment was specifically designed to detect and home on signals in the frequency range used by Monica. Immediately understanding the implications of this discovery and the scale of the disaster that had been unfolding over the previous months, as thousands of RAF bomber sorties had been flown with crews unknowingly advertising their positions to enemy fighters who could track them across vast distances. Wing Commander Derek Jackson, a distinguished physicist and signals intelligence officer who had been working on radar countermeasures throughout the war, conducted immediate flight tests using the captured Ju-88 against RAF bombers equipped with Monica, and the results were even worse than initial analysis had suggested, with Jackson demonstrating that he could track a single Monica-equipped Lancaster from 130 miles away, could identify individual aircraft within a loose formation of 5 Lancasters, and perhaps most alarmingly, could detect and track individual bombers even within a large formation of 71 Lancasters orbiting between Gloucester and Cambridge, each of them showing up as a distinct contact on the Flensburg display, despite the presence of dozens of other aircraft in the same general area. These test flights provided conclusive proof that Monica had transformed from a defensive system into an offensive liability of the first magnitude, that every RAF bomber flying with Monica active was effectively carrying a homing beacon for German night fighters, and that the technology meant to protect bomber crews had instead been marking them for death in a reversal so complete that it represented one of the most significant intelligence and technical failures of the entire war, comparable to the German failure to recognize that Allied bombers were jamming their radar with window chaff, or to the later Allied exploitation of German IFF systems through the Perfectos device. Air Marshal Harris, informed of these findings, immediately ordered Monica removed from all Bomber Command aircraft, a directive that went into effect in late July 1944, and that marked the end of tail warning radar as a defensive system for RAF heavy bombers. Though the consequences of Monica's compromise would continue to echo through operational planning and through the memories of air crews who had flown mission after mission, believing themselves protected by technology that was actually betraying them to the enemy, the American experience with tail warning radar followed a similar but slightly different trajectory than the British story, reflecting both the different operational requirements of the United States Army Air Forces and the different tactical situations faced by American bombers and fighters operating over Europe and the Pacific. The United States produced its own version of Monica, designated NAPS-13, sometimes known by the nickname Archie, using essentially the same principles and operating frequencies as the British original, but adapted to fit American aircraft and integrated with American radar systems and operational procedures. And unlike the British, who installed Monica, primarily on heavy bombers like the Lancaster and Halifax, American forces deployed NAPS-13 predominantly on fighter aircraft including the Republic, P-47 Thunderbolt and the North American P-51 Mustang that flew long-range escort missions, protecting American bomber formations during daylight raids over Germany. The logic behind installing tail warning radar on American fighters rather than bombers reflected the different tactical philosophy of the United States Army Air Forces, which, unlike RAF Bomber Command, had committed itself to daylight precision bombing based on the theory that accurate strikes against specific industrial and military targets would be more effective than the British approach of nighttime area bombing against entire cities, and daylight operations meant that American bombers flew in massive formations defended by their own concentrated firepower and by fighter escorts that engaged German interceptors before they could reach the bomber streams, making the fighters, rather than the bombers, the aircraft most vulnerable to attack from behind when German fighters attempted to break through the escort screen. American fighter pilots flying P-47s and P-51s over Germany in late 1943 and early 1944 welcomed the NAPS-13 as a potentially life-saving technology that would alert them if German fighters managed to get on their tails during the swirling dogfights that characterized fighter versus fighter combat over Europe where situational awareness and knowing the positions of both friendly and enemy aircraft could mean the difference between survival and sudden death. And the tail warning radar seemed to offer an additional layer of protection that would complement the pilot's own visual scanning and the tactical communications that allowed fighter pilots to warn each other of threats through radio calls. But the same vulnerability that had doomed Monica in RAF service also affected AN/APS-13. And when British intelligence shared the findings from the captured Ju-88 and the Flensburg tests with their American counterparts in the summer of 1944, United States Army Air Forces commanders quickly understood that their fighters were facing the same threat as British bombers had faced, that Flensburg or similar German detectors could home on AN/APS-13 emissions and guide German fighters directly toward American aircraft, whose pilots believed themselves protected by their tail warning systems. And in late 1944, American fighters operating over Europe were ordered to have their AN/APS-13 systems deactivated or removed entirely, eliminating the compromised defensive technology and forcing American pilots to rely instead on traditional methods of maintaining awareness of threats approaching from behind, including visual scanning, mirror systems, tactical formations where wingmen protected each other, and radio communications that allowed pilots to warn their squadron mates of enemy aircraft that had gotten into advantageous positions. The withdrawal of Monica and AN/APS-13 from operational service might have marked the end of tail warning radar in World War II, except for one of the most ingenious tactical innovations to emerge from the electronic warfare struggle between Allied and German forces, a counterintuitive technique that transformed the compromised defensive system into an offensive weapon and demonstrated that in the rapidly evolving technological competition of modern war, today's vulnerability could become tomorrow's advantage if creative tactical thinking could find ways to exploit enemy capabilities against themselves. After British intelligence confirmed that German night fighters were using Flensburg to home on Monica emissions, RAF planners recognized that this enemy capability could potentially be turned against the Germans if Allied aircraft could deliberately use Monica to attract German fighters and then destroy those fighters when they approached, expecting to find vulnerable bombers, but instead encountering something far more dangerous. The aircraft selected for this role was the de Havilland Mosquito night fighter, a twin-engine design that combined exceptional speed with heavy armament, including 4 20mm cannons and 4 7.7mm machine guns in the nose, along with AI Mark 8 or AI Mark 10 centimetric radar that gave Mosquito crews their own ability to detect and track enemy aircraft. And critically, the Mosquito was fast enough and maneuverable enough to engage German night fighters on equal or better terms, unlike the heavy bombers that had been Monica's original platform. A small number of Mosquitoes were fitted with Monica systems, and then deliberately flown in areas where German night fighters operated, essentially serving as bait to draw Flensburg-equipped German aircraft toward what they expected would be easy targets. And when German pilots took the bait and began closing on the Monica signals, Mosquito crews would use their own radar to detect the approaching enemy. Wait until the German fighter had committed to the approach and was focused on the Monica signal, and then execute a precisely controlled 180-degree turn that would reverse the positions of the two aircraft, placing the German fighter directly in front of the Mosquito and centered in the British aircraft's radar display and gun sight, transforming the hunter into the hunted in a matter of seconds through a maneuver that came to be known among RAF crews as flying backwards, a term that captured the counterintuitive nature of deliberately attracting enemy fighters and then using geometric advantage to reverse the tactical situation and achieve firing position on an enemy who had expected to be doing the shooting rather than being shot at. The tactical execution of the 180-degree turn maneuver that became the hallmark of Mosquito operations against Flensburg-equipped German night fighters required extraordinary skill, precise timing, and nerves of steel from pilots who were essentially gambling their lives on geometric calculations performed in darkness at altitudes where errors meant death, either from enemy fire or from losing control of their aircraft in violent maneuvers that pushed the Mosquito to the limits of its structural capabilities and aerodynamic performance envelope. The sequence began when Mosquito crews deliberately activated their Monica tail warning radar while flying predetermined patrol routes over Germany and occupied Europe, essentially advertising their presence to any Flensburg-equipped German night fighter operating within detection range, and the Mosquito navigator would monitor both the Monica display showing any aircraft approaching from behind and the AI Mark 8 or AI Mark 10 centimetric radar display showing the airspace ahead and to the sides of their own aircraft, creating a comprehensive picture of the tactical situation that allowed the crew to anticipate when German fighters would take the bait and begin closing on what they believed was a vulnerable bomber. When Monica indicated a contact approaching from astern, typically beginning at ranges of roughly 1,000 yards, when the German fighter entered Monica's detection envelope, the Mosquito crew would maintain course and altitude for several critical seconds, while the navigator tracked the closure rate and bearing of the approaching aircraft, calculating the precise moment when the German pilot would have committed to his attack run and would have his attention focused entirely on the Monica signal that appeared to promise an easy kill against what German pilots believed would be a slow-moving heavy bomber, like a Lancaster or Halifax, that could be destroyed with a single cannon burst into the fuselage or wings. The moment of the turn, the instant when the Mosquito pilot would throw his aircraft into the 180-degree reversal, required judgment that bordered on precognition. Understanding exactly when the German fighter pilot had committed psychologically and physically to his intercept geometry and would be unable to react quickly enough when the tactical situation suddenly reversed itself. And this timing came from experience and intuition developed through repeated encounters and through understanding how German pilots thought and how they approached what they believed were defenseless targets. The physical execution of the turn itself involved the Mosquito pilot banking hard in the direction that would position his aircraft's nose toward the approaching German fighter, pulling maximum G-forces that would grey out vision and press both crew members hard into their seats, maintaining just enough altitude and airspeed through the turn to avoid stalling while bleeding off enough speed that the turning radius would be as tight as possible. And as the Mosquito completed its rotation through 180 degrees, the German night fighter that had been pursuing from behind would suddenly appear directly ahead on the British aircraft's AI radar display, positioned perfectly in the cone of detection and centered in the firing solution for the 420mm cannons and 47.7mm machine guns that gave the Mosquito devastating firepower at close range. The psychological impact on German pilots when they realized what had happened was profound and immediate, transforming in seconds from confident hunters closing on what they believed was easy prey into desperate targets trying to evade cannon fire from an enemy they hadn't known was there, an enemy whose very presence contradicted everything they had been taught about RAF bomber tactics and defensive capabilities. And in the brief seconds before Mosquito cannon shells tore through their aircraft, German pilots experienced the terrible understanding that they had been deceived, that the Monica signal they had followed was not a bomber's defensive radar, but rather bait in a trap that had been designed specifically to exploit their own Flensburg equipment and their own tactical doctrines. For those German night fighter crews who survived encounters with Mosquitoes employing this tactic, the experience created lasting psychological trauma that German aircrew referred to as Mosquito Schreck or Mosquito Terror, a pervasive fear that any Monica signal might be a trap, that any approach toward what appeared to be a bomber might instead lead to sudden death at the hands of British fighters who seemed to appear from nowhere with perfect firing solutions and who demonstrated aerial skills that many German pilots found difficult to comprehend or counter. And this psychological warfare dimension proved almost as effective as the physical destruction of German aircraft because it made Luftwaffe night fighter crews hesitant and cautious in situations where aggressiveness and decisive action would previously have been their standard response. The 180-degree turn tactic worked because it combined technical exploitation of German radar systems with tactical surprise and with the superior performance characteristics of the Mosquito, which at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour was faster than virtually any German night fighter in operational service during 1944 and 1945, could outturn the heavier German aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and Junkers Ju-88 that comprised the majority of Luftwaffe night fighter strength and possessed firepower concentration that allowed Mosquito pilots to destroy enemy aircraft with short bursts rather than requiring extended tracking and multiple passes that would give German pilots opportunities to escape or counterattack. The operational deployment of Monica-equipped Mosquitoes as part of No. 100 Group RAF, the Specialized Bomber Support Formation, established in November 1943, specifically to reduce losses among Bomber Command's heavy bomber force through a combination of electronic countermeasures and offensive fighter operations, represented a fundamental shift in how the Royal Air Force approached the night air war over Germany and demonstrated that technological superiority alone was insufficient without tactical innovation and operational flexibility that could adapt to enemy countermeasures and exploit enemy vulnerabilities as they were discovered. No. 100 Group operated from 8 airfields scattered across Norfolk in eastern England, flying approximately 260 aircraft, including roughly 140 Mosquito night fighters of various marks alongside heavy bombers like Halifaxes, Sterlings and American-built flying fortresses and Liberators that had been converted to carry electronic jamming equipment designed to blind German radar, disrupt German radio communications, and create false targets that would overwhelm enemy defensive systems with information that made it impossible to distinguish real bomber streams from electronic phantoms. The Mosquito squadrons within 100 Group, including No. 85 Squadron, commanded by Wing Commander Brandsey, Burbridge, who would become the highest-scoring Mosquito ace with 21 confirmed kills achieved between 1944 and 1945, No. 157 Squadron, No. 169 Squadron, and several others, flew missions that combined multiple tactical SEAS approaches, including what the RAF designated as serrate patrols, where Mosquitoes used passive detection equipment to home on emissions from German Liechtenstein airborne intercept radar, allowing British fighters to track German night fighters by detecting the very radar systems those German aircraft used to find RAF bombers, essentially turning German technology against itself in a mirror image of how Flensburg exploited Monica. The serrate system, which detected the relatively high-power UHF and VHF emissions from early versions of German AI radar, including the Liechtenstein BC and C1 models operating around 490 MHz, gave Mosquito crews the ability to find German night fighters at ranges exceeding 30 miles, far beyond visual detection distance and even beyond the range of the Mosquito's own AI radar. And when combined with the Monica deception tactic, Serrat created a comprehensive electronic warfare capability that allowed 100 Group Mosquitoes to dominate the night skies over Germany through a combination of superior technology, superior tactics, and superior aircrew training that emphasized flexibility and initiative, rather than rigid adherence to predetermined mission profiles. Beyond the airborne intercepts, 100 Group Mosquitoes also flew what were designated as intruder missions, patrolling German night fighter airfields and attacking aircraft during their most vulnerable moments when taking off or landing, when pilots had their attention focused on navigating in darkness with minimal lighting that had been reduced to prevent attracting enemy attention, when aircraft were low and slow and unable to maneuver effectively, and when fuel loads and ammunition made German fighters particularly susceptible to catastrophic damage from even limited hits. These intruder operations created a climate of constant fear among Luftwaffe night fighter crews who understood that returning to base after a mission against RAF bombers meant running a gauntlet where British Mosquitoes might be waiting in the darkness to attack at the moment when German pilots were most exhausted and least able to defend themselves, and the psychological impact of this constant threat manifested in increased accident rates as German pilots rushed their landing approaches to minimize exposure time, crashed due to pilot error exacerbated by exhaustion and stress, or fell victim to friendly anti-aircraft fire when nervous German gunners shot at anything moving near their airfields without waiting for positive identification. The statistics compiled by 100 Group over the final 18 months of the war demonstrated the effectiveness of these combined tactics, with Mosquito squadrons claiming 258 German aircraft destroyed between December 1943 and April 1945, while losing only 70 Mosquitoes to all causes including combat, accidents, mechanical failures, and losses to the small numbers of advanced German fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet that appeared in limited quantities during the war's final months, but never in sufficient numbers to seriously challenge British air superiority, a kill ratio of nearly 4-to-1 that was extraordinary for air combat operations and that demonstrated conclusively that technological innovation, combined with tactical flexibility, could overcome even well-established enemy defensive systems that had previously inflicted unsustainable casualties on Allied bombing forces. The impact on German night fighter operations was measured not just in aircraft destroyed, but in missions aborted, in German fighters forced to land at alternate airfields to avoid Mosquito patrols, in the psychological burden that 100 Group imposed on Luftwaffe crews who never knew when or where they might encounter British fighters who seemed to possess almost supernatural ability to find German aircraft in darkness and to attack from positions of overwhelming advantage, and in the gradual erosion of Luftwaffe night fighter effectiveness that allowed RAF Bomber Command to reduce its loss rates from the catastrophic 5% or higher that had characterized operations during the Battle of Berlin to roughly 1% during the final year of the war, a reduction that saved thousands of British airmen's lives and allowed Bomber Command to maintain the sustained pressure on German industry and infrastructure that contributed to Nazi Germany's eventual collapse in May 1945. The individual experiences of pilots who flew these missions reveal both the technical challenges and the human dimensions of aerial combat conducted in complete darkness using electronic systems that represented the cutting edge of 1940s technology, but that by modern standards appear almost impossibly primitive, requiring air crews to interpret information displayed on small cathode ray tubes, to coordinate actions between pilot and navigator who sat side by side in the Mosquito's cramped cockpit, to maintain spatial orientation while executing violent maneuvers in conditions where the horizon disappeared and where vestibular illusions could convince pilots that up was down, and that their aircraft was flying straight and level when in fact it was entering a death spiral toward the ground thousands of feet below. Flight Lieutenant John Quinton of No. 141 Squadron described in his combat reports the sensation of flying with Monica active over Germany, knowing that he was deliberately attracting enemy attention and that at any moment a German night fighter might appear behind his aircraft, trusting that his navigator would detect the threat in time and that his own reflexes and aircraft handling skills would be sufficient to execute the 180-degree turn and reverse the tactical situation before German cannons could tear his Mosquito apart, and Quinton noted that the mental strain of this tactic was in some ways more exhausting than conventional fighter operations because it required maintaining concentration for extended periods while waiting for contact rather than experiencing the focused intensity of brief engagements followed by relative calm. Wing Commander Burbridge, the ace who achieved 21 confirmed victories and who developed many of the tactical refinements that made the 180-degree turn increasingly effective as 100 Group crews accumulated experience, emphasized in post-war interviews that success in these operations depended less on individual heroics than on crew coordination between pilot and navigator, with the navigator's ability to interpret radar displays and calculate intercept geometry being just as important as the pilot's flying skills. And Burbridge credited his navigator, Flying Officer Bill Skelton, as an equal partner in their successes, noting that the Mosquito's two-man crew concept allowed for a division of labor where the pilot could focus entirely on flying the aircraft while the navigator managed navigation, radio communications, and tactical awareness using the various electronic systems that filled the Mosquito's cockpit and required constant monitoring and adjustment. The accounts from German night fighter pilots who encountered these tactics and survived provide the other perspective on these engagements, describing the confusion and terror of following what appeared to be a straightforward intercept on a bomber only to discover suddenly that they were being pursued by a British fighter whose presence had been completely undetected until cannon shells began striking their aircraft, and several German pilots who were shot down by 100 Group Mosquitoes and who survived to become prisoners of war, reported in interrogations that they had become increasingly reluctant to pursue Monica. Contacts after hearing from surviving comrades about the cease 180-degree turn tactic, preferring instead to search for bombers that did not emit Monica signals, even though this meant passing up what appeared to be easy opportunities because the risk of encountering a mosquito trap seemed too high. Major Wilhelm Herget, a Luftwaffe night fighter ace with 57 confirmed victories, who flew primarily against RAF bombers from 1943 through 1945, described in post-war memoirs how the introduction of aggressive mosquito intruder operations fundamentally changed German night fighter tactics, forcing Luftwaffe crews to spend almost as much time watching for British fighters as they spent searching for bombers, creating a defensive mentality that was completely contrary to the aggressive intercept tactics that had characterized German night fighter operations during earlier phases of the strategic bombing campaign, when Luftwaffe crews had enjoyed significant advantages through their radar technology and tactical positioning. The technological lessons learned from the Monica-Flensburg encounter and from the tactical responses that emerged influenced post-war development of radar systems and electronic warfare capabilities across multiple nations as military establishments attempted to understand the implications of a conflict where electronic systems had proven capable of determining tactical outcomes as surely as traditional factors like aircraft performance or pilot skill, where the ability to detect enemy emissions and exploit enemy radar had created entirely new dimensions of aerial combat that would become increasingly important during the Cold War era when sophisticated electronic systems would proliferate across all military forces. The fundamental principle that any active transmitter could be detected by passive receivers and that this detection could occur at ranges far exceeding the active system's own detection range became a cornerstone of electronic warfare doctrine, informing the design of radar, warning receivers that would become standard equipment on military aircraft by the 1960s, and that would evolve into increasingly sophisticated systems capable of identifying specific radar types, estimating range and bearing to radar emitters, and providing threat warning that allowed pilots to take evasive action or employ countermeasures before enemy missiles or interceptors could engage them. The concept of using enemy electronic emissions as homing beacons, which Flensburg had demonstrated against Monica and which Serate had demonstrated against German Liechtenstein radar, led directly to development of anti-radiation missiles during the 1950s and 60s, weapons designed specifically to follow radar emissions back to their source and destroy radar installations, an evolution from passive detection to active destruction that represented the logical extension of principles first demonstrated operationally during World War II, but refined through decades of subsequent development and combat experience in conflicts, including Korea, Vietnam, and the various Middle Eastern wars, where electronic warfare became increasingly central to achieving air superiority. The psychological dimensions of electronic warfare, particularly the understanding that uncertainty about enemy capabilities could be as tactically valuable as actual destruction of enemy forces, informed development of jamming systems and deception techniques designed not necessarily to blind enemy radar completely, but rather to create sufficient uncertainty that enemy operators would hesitate or make incorrect decisions, trading psychological advantage for physical destruction in ways that the Mosquito Schreck phenomenon had demonstrated during operations over Germany in 1944 and 1945. American military establishments paid particular attention to British electronic warfare developments, including the Monica Compromise and the tactical responses, incorporating lessons learned into development of American radar warning systems and into training programs for electronic warfare officers, who would become standard crew members on American bombers. and later on, specialized electronic warfare aircraft, like the Douglas EB-66, destroyer that flew electronic countermeasures, missions during Vietnam, or the Grumman EA-6B Prowler that served as the United States Navy's primary electronic eye attack platform from the 1970s through the early 21st century. The organizational structure of No. 100 Group RAF, which consolidated electronic warfare capabilities and offensive counter-air operations under unified command, rather than scattering these functions across multiple organizations with different priorities and potentially conflicting approaches, became a model for how military forces could integrate emerging technologies into operational frameworks that maximized their effectiveness. And this organizational innovation proved in some ways as important as the specific technical systems, because it ensured that electronic warfare would be conducted as part of a coherent strategy rather than as ad hoc responses to immediate tactical problems. Soviet military observers, studying captured German equipment and interrogating captured German personnel after the war ended, also drew lessons from the Flensburg-Monaco encounter and from British electronic warfare tactics, incorporating these lessons into Soviet development of radar systems and electronic countermeasures that would characterize Cold War-era confrontations between NATO and Warsaw Pact forces, creating an ongoing technological competition where each side continuously developed new systems designed to counter the other side's capabilities while simultaneously protecting their own systems from exploitation. The human stories behind these technical and tactical innovations remind us that even in an era of increasingly sophisticated technology, where electronic systems mediated combat encounters and where success or failure often depended on the performance of radar equipment and radio transmitters rather than traditional martial skills, the courage and ingenuity of individual human beings remained central to determining outcomes and to creating the innovations that would reshape how aerial warfare was conducted. The young pilots and navigators who flew Mosquitoes over Germany night after night during the final 2 years of World War II, who deliberately made themselves targets by activating Monaco, and who trusted their skills and their aircraft and their crewmates to survive encounters with enemy fighters who possessed every advantage except surprise, demonstrated extraordinary courage that was different in character, but equal in magnitude to the courage of previous generations of warriors who had faced their enemies in more direct and immediate forms of combat. And these Mosquito crews understood that they were pioneers in a new kind of warfare, where success required mastering both traditional flying skills and the emerging discipline of electronic warfare that would only become more important as technology continued to advance. The German night fighter pilots who adapted to British tactics, who learned to be suspicious of Monaco signals, and who developed their own counter-tactics, including attempting to identify Mosquitoes before committing to intercepts and coordinating attacks by multiple fighters to reduce vulnerability to the 180-degree turn maneuver, also demonstrated professional skill and adaptability under conditions where they faced overwhelming material disadvantages and where the psychological burden of constant threat from invisible enemies took its toll on morale and effectiveness in ways that traditional military training had not prepared them to handle. The scientists and engineers on both sides who developed the radar systems and countermeasures, who worked in laboratories far from combat zones, but whose innovations directly determined whether young men lived or died in night skies over Europe, carried their own burdens of responsibility and made their own contributions to victory and defeat through technical excellence and creative problem-solving that pushed the boundaries of what was technologically possible with 1940s electronics and manufacturing capabilities. The intelligence officers who analyzed captured equipment, who interrogated prisoners, who compiled reports on enemy capabilities and vulnerabilities, and who translated technical understanding into tactical recommendations that operational commanders could implement in combat, formed essential links between technical knowledge and operational effectiveness, without which even the most sophisticated equipment would have been far less useful, because effective employment of technology requires understanding not just how systems work, but also how enemies might exploit them and how friendly forces can protect against such exploitation. The story of how British and American pilots learned to fly backwards to outsmart German radar ultimately transcends the specific technical details of Monaco and Flensburg and 180-degree turns to reveal something essential about the nature of modern warfare and about human capacity for innovation under pressure, demonstrating that even in conflicts dominated by industrial production and technological sophistication, individual creativity and tactical flexibility remain crucial determinants of success, that enemies will always find ways to exploit friendly systems and that survival requires constant adaptation and willingness to abandon established practices when they become liabilities, and that the relationship between technology and tactics is dialectical and dynamic, with each side continuously developing new capabilities that force the other side to respond with innovations of their own in an endless cycle that drives military evolution forward through competition and through the terrible necessity of finding better ways to fight and survive in environments where failure means death, not just for individuals, but potentially for entire nations, whose security depends on maintaining advantages over adversaries who are equally motivated and equally capable of technical and tactical innovation when circumstances demand such creativity.